Very much pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Laurie Oakes. He's a journalist with The Sun, and as you're probably well aware, he's the author and co-author, he's the author of a book called Whitlam PM, and he's the co-author of a book called Grab for Power and the Making of Australian Prime Minister. Would you all welcome him, please?
Thanks very much. This is an unusual experience for me, being at the wrong end of a meeting. It's like looking through a telescope the wrong way. But I was rather pleased when I was invited to be the speaker here, until yesterday when I saw what can happen to a speaker who disappoints. And unlike Mr. Cameron, you probably do give a damn what I say. Anyway, election campaigns, and do they matter? I wouldn't be surprised if we get the chance to study that subject at first hand about the second week of July, or rather the 3 or 4 weeks leading up to it. It's not a particularly profound subject because it's one of those questions to which the answer is pretty obvious. I chose it really so that I could do a bit of rambling about the subject of campaigning generally. I may be doing your HSC course an injustice because I don't know a lot about it, but when I studied politics at university, and in those unenlightened days we weren't allowed to talk about politics at school, we dealt pretty much entirely with dry stuff like systems of government, various forms of political structure, mainly overseas, and the political philosophy of various extinct gentlemen. And there was very little which actually prepared me or anyone else, I think, for what politics is really like in practice. And that might partly explain why my old lecturer from those days, one Peter Westaway, has just failed again to get himself elected to the Senate, thanks to the New South Wales Premier and someone called Cleaver Bunton. That name sounds to me like a mass murderer, but instead of some of the high-flown textbooks on our reading list, I often think we would have been better to read people like Ambrose Bierce, who in his Devil's Dictionary provides a number of useful insights. For example, he defines an elector as one who enjoys the sacred privilege of voting for the man of another man's choice. I couldn't, unfortunately, have had the benefit of Joe McGuinness's book on the 1968 US presidential campaign, The Selling of the President. It was written about 8 years too late, so no one told me that politics, in a sense, has always been a con game. And in those days, none of us had heard of Marshall McLuhan. I don't think we even had television sets. And we'd never read his assertion that policies and issues are useless for election purposes since they are too specialised and hot. The shaping of a candidate's integral image has taken the place of discussing conflicting points of view. It may be, of course, that you do get down to the nitty-gritty of politics in the HSC course. And since most people only become directly involved with politics at election time, I think election campaigns are very much the nitty-gritty of politics. In any case, the question I've posed as the title of this talk is not entirely without point, because one of the politicians who's always fascinated me, the late Ben Chifley, did not think election campaigns mattered much at all. He stumped the country, addressed meetings and spoke on the radio. There was no television then, and I gather he had the same sort of problem with radio that Arthur Corwell had with television, that Ben sounded rather the way that Arthur used to look. But he did this mainly because his party expected it. Chifley did not really believe that all the hoo-ha of campaigning, to coin a phrase, had a great deal of impact on the outcome of an election. He once said during a campaign, quote, "The people made up their minds 6 months ago. They judge our policy, not our propaganda," end of quote. And in a letter to a friend quoted in Professor Crisp's biography, Chifley commented, "I think that elections are determined psychologically some time before the climax of the campaign, and although there may be a lot of people who do not make up their minds until the last few days, the things that cause them to make a final decision have already been planted in their minds." Over the years, other politicians and political commentators, particularly old-timers like Alan Reid, have expressed similar views. And yet every 3 years at least, every 18 months while Senate and House of Representatives polls are held separately, and possibly more frequently than that in the current situation, where an opposition with a Senate majority assumes the right to send the government to the people whenever it's in the mood, vast amounts of time, money, effort, expertise and emotion are expended on election campaigns, not to mention a subject dear to my heart, books about election campaigns. Is it all wasted? Are election campaigns fundamentally just recurring rituals, or do they play a major part in determining the way people vote? Is the campaigning process significant in deciding who will govern the nation? Someone presumably thinks that campaigns do matter. How else to explain the vast expenditure of money in the 3 weeks or so prior to an election? In the election in May last year, for example, about $1.5 million was spent by the various political parties just on radio and television advertising. And that did not include the cost of producing the commercials or the agency fees, nor did it include print advertising, pamphlets, the hiring of halls, costs of communication, campaign organisations, and all the other expenses associated with an election. The 1974 campaign cost well over $2 million, I would think, and it's a safe bet that the next one will cost much, much more. Research in the United States clearly indicates that campaigns have an important effect on the outcome of elections. Analyses of presidential elections over the 20 years from 1948 suggest that about a third of voters make up their minds before the nominating conventions. These are obviously the hardcore Republican and Democrat partisans. Another third decide during the conventions which way they will vote, and the remaining third make their decision during the campaign proper. Under the American system, of course, the nominating conventions and the primary campaigns are really part of the overall campaigning process. But even if only a third of voters are considered to be influenced by the actual presidential campaign, that's an extremely significant proportion of voters. What about Australia, where the system is rather different, where there are no nominating conventions and the party leaders and other candidates for office are known long before the campaign is imminent? I think it can be shown that campaigns can be extremely important in Australia, and to my mind the elections which best illustrate this were the 63 federal election and the poll last May. Both of them were called suddenly in 1963 by the then Prime Minister Sir Robert Menzies to gain a political advantage, and in 74 by the opposition announcing that it would block supply in the Senate until the government agreed to go to the polls. There was, in other words, no real lead-up, as there would be with an election held roughly on schedule at the end of a normal parliamentary term, and voters were caught relatively unprepared. Labor, you will recall, came within one seat of winning office in the 1961 election. From then on, virtually to the time Sir Robert called another election, public opinion polls showed the ALP with a high level of support, high enough to give it an excellent chance of winning next time round. The Labor Party itself believed victory in 63 was assured, and as a result of the 63 election, the Prime Minister, Mr Whitlam, who was totally sure of the outcome of that one, no longer trusts his own judgment in these matters. But after Sir Robert called the snap election, the situation changed fairly dramatically. A week or so before polling day, and this is a scoop, the story's never been told before, the Labor leader, Mr Arthur Calwell, campaigning in Western Australia, received a phone call from an executive of the only public opinion poll firm then operating, which shall remain nameless. The executive said that the latest poll had shown a sudden slump in support for the ALP. It indicated that Labor would be soundly beaten. The executive hastened to add that because the results were so different from those earlier polls, he did not believe them. He was convinced there had been what he called a sampling error, and he planned to make a subjective adjustment to the figures before they were published. In fact, the raw figures turned out to be almost spot on, the actual results on election day, and because of the subjective adjustment, the polling firm was rather embarrassingly wrong in its predictions. It's clear that there was a marked swing against Labor after the election campaign was underway, and it occurred, incidentally, before the Kennedy assassination, which was later blamed for turning many voters away from the ALP. In April last year, when for the first time ever an opposition used the Senate to force a government from office, the opinion polls indicated that the Liberals and country parties were ahead of Labor in public support. I think from memory the poll results were rather as they are at the moment. 6 weeks later that was no longer the case and the Labor government was returned. I think it's fairly obvious that in 1974 the campaign period was important, and certainly the Liberals believed so. Those with cold feet about forcing another election now, and I should mention that this bit was prepared before yesterday's little effort, which has given those Liberals a bit more courage. They use as one of their arguments the claim that in any campaign Mr Whitlam's electioneering ability is worth a swing of anything up to 5% in Labor's favour. And Mr Whitlam believes that although the opinion polls at the moment indicate Labor would be defeated in an election, given 6 weeks of campaigning he could repeat the result of last May. There's also some research evidence relating to the 74 election. Normally politicians and parties worry about research before an election, not afterwards. But last year the ALP had some money left over, the first time that's ever happened after a campaign, And they commissioned Australian nationwide opinion polls to conduct a post-election survey on the very sensible grounds that the findings might prove useful in preparing the next campaign. The Liberals also carried out research on what had gone wrong with their effort, and they saw this as the beginning of planning for the next campaign. During the May campaign, ANOP had identified a group of people it classed as swinging voters. The ANOP tests indicated that swinging voters made up about 18% of the electorate. I might say there that the Liberal research identified about 30% of people as swingers, but the two criteria are quite different. One of the most interesting findings from the post-election survey was that in general the swingers made up their minds quite late. About 35% did not decide which way to vote until the last few days of the campaign, excuse me, and 16% made their decision on polling day itself. 3/4 of the sample group of swing voters made up their minds on how to vote during the 3 weeks of official campaigning by the parties. Election campaigns have peripheral functions such as galvanising party faithful into an enthusiastic effort, but naturally the main aim is to get to potential swing voters. The evidence suggests that in this respect the 74 campaign was important, and incidentally about 54% of the swing voters identified by ANOP ended up voting Labor. All of this is not to deny that there's considerable truth in what Chifley said. The 1972 election campaign, for example, was an extremely exciting and hard-fought contest, and I think it's probably the most exciting election I've ever been involved in. But that election provided support for the argument that election campaigns, or some of them, are not as important as we would like to think. As the British election analyst David Butler wrote in the book Labour to Power, which came out in opposition to a certain other book on that election, quote, "The 3 nationwide polls stayed in substantial agreement throughout the final weeks. They recorded no significant movement in voting intention, and they were vindicated by the results," unquote. He went on to add, however, "The campaign seems to have served mainly to reinforce the voters in their prejudices and to confirm what the commentators had long been saying about the leaders and the parties." End of quote. It could be argued, I think, that these effects in themselves made the campaign significant. I believe that if Mr McMahon had campaigned well instead of dramatising his frailties on the hustings, if the opposition campaign had been better organised, or even organised at all, if divisions within the Liberal Party and between the coalition parties had been papered over for the duration, and if the Labor campaign had not been such a smoothly professional effort and Mr Whitlam not in such good form, the result might have been different. There are quite a few ifs there. But the swing which gave Labor victory was only 2.5%, the smallest movement of votes between parties since 1958. It can even be argued that the 1974 campaign gave some support to Chifley's contention that the things that cause voters to make a final decision have already been planted in their minds. Another survey conducted by McNair Anderson asked voters which party had the best policy on a number of issues. On education, 67% thought Labor's policy was best, and only 22% favoured the opposition policy. Labor also scored much better than the coalition on social welfare, overseas control of Australian resources, public health and urban development. Basically, on all these issues, what Mr Whitlam had said during the campaign was, "This is what we've done." He presented very few new policies. So presumably many voters were in fact voting on the basis of things which had been implemented some time before. But it had been the Labor Party's worry that the government's achievements in these and other areas had not been properly publicised and sold to the electorate, that few voters realised what had been done. The election campaign provided the government with an opportunity to convey this sort of information to the electorate, to remind voters, in other words, of what had earlier been planted in their minds. And even here, I would think, the campaign was important. It's not only the immediate result which matters in an election campaign. A campaign can have long-term effects, and this is something that's quite often forgotten. Even though it may not bring victory in the short term, a campaign can begin to shift party loyalties, bring issues to the attention of the public, introduce candidates to the electorate, and help in the creation and projection of a party or a leader image, all things which can have a bearing on future elections. Mr Whitlam's efforts before 1972, and particularly the 69 election campaign, which he technically lost, I would put into this category. I've just used the word image, and some of you probably winced. I usually do. The Madison Avenue connotations offend many people who take their politics seriously and like to think of the political process in terms of issues, policies and logical debate. But image, or the impression a party or a particular politician makes on the electorate, has always been important. although the word itself came into vogue only recently. Attempts by politicians to project a particular image are nothing new. When Sir Robert Menzies posed with his first grandchild for the cover of Women's Weekly many years ago, he was image building. Grandfathers are venerable and wise, to be loved, admired and trusted, and that is the way Sir Robert wanted voters to see him. Of course he was too. It's not only television which has made image an important thing in politics, but in the television age it's true that image matters more and issues and policies less. And if there's time and if you're not too bored, I might have more to say on that later. Like everything else, election campaigning is becoming more scientific. Only 17 years ago, Dr. Evatt, as Labor Party leader, used to stump the country in an election campaign, accompanied only by a stenographer and a suitcase. Compare this with elections these days, when each of the major party leaders travels in his own VIP plane with a huge team of experts. On each team, as well as the party leader, there'll be perhaps 2 specialist speechwriters, sometimes 3 or 4. A media expert whose job is simply to look after the press, sometimes someone just look after television as well, a couple of political operatives who usually have the title private secretary, other advisors of various sorts, these days usually on economics, and 3 or 4 stenographers continuously hammering out speeches, press releases or briefing notes. Several advance men precede the leader and his team into each centre to finalise arrangements for public appearances, press conferences, interviews, meetings and media happenings, and to prepare briefing notes on local issues so that the leader can appear to be totally knowledgeable on an area which he probably hasn't heard of before. At each place visited, a well-equipped campaign office is set up containing everything from typewriters to photocopying machines to a new device known as a Vocodex. This is a facsimile device which enables documents to be transmitted over the telephone. During last year's campaign, Mr. Whitlam had transcripts of Mr. Snedden's daily press conferences transmitted to him by Vocodex within hours and could comment on what the opposition leader had said on the same day, sometimes with fairly telling effect. Things will be even more streamlined in the next campaign. The Liberals, for example, plan to set up a national campaign headquarters in either Sydney or Melbourne, controlled by the party's federal director, manned by Liberal researchers and machine men, with advertising agency representatives on the spot, and ultra-modern communications units, complete with colour television facilities, radio, landlines, telex, etc., all as part of the one operation. Campaigning used to be a seat of the pants affair, but these days politicians have available to them such modern navigational aids as opinion polls. When an election is called suddenly, as in '74, there's not really time to make proper use of polling in advance, although the Liberals had done some research on the mood of the electorate and its reactions to such issues as inflation last year. This year the opposition parties are polling for all they're worth. In the United States, every prominent politician has his own private pollster. It's obviously useful for politicians prior to a campaign to know which issues are concerning the electorate and the attitudes to them held by a majority of voters. Behavioural scientists, which is the euphemism which pollsters like to be known by, can find out. More important, they can isolate the attitudes of key groups of voters, the target groups to whom a particular politician wants to pitch his appeal. This saves parties and politicians from the risks and uncertainties of trying to guess the views of the electorate. It can also save them the trouble of having to lead opinion, or even of having to develop their own opinions at all. A politician can spout what the polls tell him most voters want him to say, and come out looking like the leader of a popular movement. Polls in marginal electorates can also give a political party an indication of its chances of winning an election at a particular time. The polls, in other words, private polls as much as those which you and I read in our newspapers, will have a great bearing on whether we have the agony of another election early this year or not. In September 1973, the Liberal Party's National Campaign Committee, which is now called the Federal Campaign Committee to disguise the fact that the party's campaign machinery is being increasingly centralised, that's the new dirty word in the Liberal Party, decided to commission a national survey to help plan the opposition's campaign against the prices and incomes referendums 3 months later. After the referendums, the Liberals kept the polling going. In December '73 and January '74, the polling firm Quantum Market Research carried out a second phase of the survey, which involved interviewing 3,000 people, the most extensive research project ever carried out by an Australian political party. It covered all age groups and all sections of the community. It was designed to test voter attitudes on various issues and policies. It was possible from the survey to isolate groups of people according to age, sex, occupation, education and socio-economic factors, and to discover which issues concerned them, how they reacted to various policy ideas, and what was likely to persuade them to change the way they voted. The survey also identified a large group of swinging voters in all age, sex, educational and socio-economic groups. The Liberals decided to make the survey a semi-permanent thing. They plan to keep coming back to the swingers and regularly test their attitudes so that at any given time they'll have a good idea of the issues and policies likely to win them votes in an election campaign. Now that is being done. They've stuck to that plan, although the firm of Quantum is no longer involved with the exercise. And the findings of recent surveys among this group of swing voters are interesting. They've had a considerable effect on Liberal planning, particularly the planning of the proposed mid-term campaign, which will turn into the real thing if the opposition senators grasp the nettle. A survey of the swing voters showed that they were not particularly interested at the moment in advertisements about politics, policies and issues when there was no election imminent. In the words of the Liberal Party's advertising agency, they can't go out and buy. In other words, if they can't vote, they find political material about issues and policies frustrating and even irritating. A mid-term campaign based on issues and policies could in fact, or so the survey suggests, be counterproductive. The survey also showed that the swing voters were not interested in advertisements showing Liberal politicians, a finding which must have been a bit sobering for some of those involved. But as a result, the Liberals are considering an extensive and expensive campaign, mainly in the form of television commercials with some radio material and with no politicians, on what is described as the fundamentals of liberalism: emphasis on concern for the individual opportunity, concern for the community, etc. It's a soft sell approach based on replies from swing voters in the survey, which indicated that they were interested in what political parties were about, particularly the Liberal Party, which apparently has a somewhat fuzzy image. There's that word again. But it describes what the proposed Liberal mid-term campaign aims at: the creation of a new, clearer image for the party, one which will help to counter charges of Me Tooism when Liberal policies resemble those of Labor, and which also the Liberals hope ties in with the way Australians like to see themselves. The Liberals are after an image which they believe the average Australian will be able to identify with. If this goes ahead, I think you'll agree it's going to be a fairly interesting exercise in mass persuasion. Mock-ups of the television commercials have already been done, and now the Liberal Party's advertising agency is making some of them in virtually final form to show to state Liberal branch finance committees. If the party and its supporters will put up the money, it could cost up to $400,000 for a proper 3-month TV advertising campaign. The commercials will go to air in about a month. The proposed series of commercials are still being called a mid-term campaign, even though Mr. Snedden is obviously intent on forcing an election about the middle of the year if he can. I suppose the concept of a mid-term campaign is another acknowledgement that there is validity in Chifley's view that many voters make up their minds on how to vote well in advance of the 3 or 4 week election campaign proper. The Labor Party, you'll recall, pioneered the idea of a mid-term campaign in 1971. It did not have the money for a television advertising effort, but it organised a series of full-scale press conferences around the country to get exposure for Mr. Whitlam and for key Labor shadow ministers. The Liberal Country Party opposition's mid-term campaign also involves big rallies attended by Mr. Snedden and other members of the shadow ministry. You no doubt remember the rain-soaked happening at Randwick Racecourse a couple of weeks ago. Similar happenings are planned in other capitals, and happening is the right word, I think. They're not simply meetings, they're designed as media occasions. There has to be something to attract and interest the television cameras other than a lot of politicians talking about politics. Hence the rock bands and pop stars and other gimmicks. The emphasis is on pictures, not talk, image rather than content. Mr. Whitlam in 1971 was old-fashioned. Each of his mid-term campaign press conferences was designed to explain and publicise a particular aspect of Labor policy. The Liberal rallies are not about policy. They're about creating an impression that there's a great popular enthusiasm for Mr. Snedden and for a change of government. This brings me to another point about modern political campaigning, the unreality of it all. Let me quote from an American book, The Political Persuaders, by Dan Nimmo, which most of you have probably read. He writes, quote, "Because so many Americans use and obtain gratifications from the mass media, it is their principal source of political reality, and because it is filled with second-hand pseudo-events, the mass of citizens can but imagine what politics is like while only the governing elites are privy to the reality. End of quote. I think that's fairly true. Campaigning these days in Australia, as in the US, is full of second-hand pseudo-events. When Mr Whitlam flew to Seymour to inspect flood damage on the day before the May 18 poll last year, it was not because he was desperately concerned about what had happened. His advisers suggested the Seymour trip to get him on television. The mud, the water, the ruined houses, the army ducks, that sort of thing provided a visually interesting setting for him to be filmed in. When during the May campaign Mr Snedden swooped into suburban shopping centres by helicopter, it was not because he was determined to meet as many shoppers in person as he possibly could. Again, the aim was to provide pictures for the television cameras. Mr Snedden did not visit his old primary school in Perth last May because he's madly sentimental. He could have done that any time in the previous 30 years. That too was a media occasion, something different for the television men to film early in the day. All these things were pseudo-events, stooged up because television is not very interested in politicians talking at meetings. It demands something visual and fresh every day. And these pseudo-events have nothing to do with issues, policies or logical argument, but they do have a great deal to do with image, with creating an impression on television viewers. The Liberal rallies, such as the Randwick Racecourse happening, are very much in the same category. Television, according to surveys, is the news medium which people trust most. They're more inclined to believe what they see on television than what they read in the newspapers. This, of course, makes television an attractive medium to politicians. It has the added advantage that on television there is no intermediary. There's no political journalist interpreting what politicians say, explaining the background, putting it into context, and perhaps throwing the odd doubt into the minds of readers. A politician can create a direct impression on the viewer. It sounds good, but it has some dangers, I think. To illustrate my point, let me quote a television expert, Mr Richard Kroll, writing in the book Looking at the Liberals. Mr Kroll, it should be said, is very much involved in politics on the Liberal side. He's the director of the New South Wales Liberal Party's communications unit. He writes, quote, "I often hear people talk on the penetration of the close-up television camera, of its ability to seek out the truth. Used on the amateur, I agree. With the professional, the opposite is the case. In the hands of an expert, the camera lies, and it is made more deadly by the average viewer's belief that it doesn't." End of quote. Television can falsify reality. In The Political Persuaders, Dan Nimmo writes of an episode which occurred in California in 1964. He writes, quote, "In January, Senator Claire Engle decided to seek re-election despite the fact that he had undergone serious brain surgery in August, had a paralysed arm, and could hardly walk or talk. He announced his candidacy in a 42-second television film which had been repeatedly filmed and minutely edited to contain little indication of disability. The appearance of health submerged the actuality of illness. Engle died before the primary." And Nimmo continues, "The incident suggests the possibilities that lie in manufacturing false images." That sort of thing, as far as I know, has not happened in Australia. But there has been falsification on a smaller scale. After the opposition parties decided to force an election in April last year, for example, Mr Whitlam held a press conference. Mr Snedden wanted to reply, but at that stage, because the Liberals hadn't finalised their policy, he was not anxious to submit himself to questioning. One channel made it appear that Mr Snedden had actually held a press conference and was answering a question. The episode wasn't particularly important, but it shows, I think, the possibility of misuse. I'm not criticising television as a campaign medium or as a source of news, but I am saying that things are not always what they seem, and that politicians can take advantage of the faith people have in the veracity of what they see on their television screens. The in thing in campaigns in the US these days is the telethon, a television program in which a politician answers questions phoned in from viewers. I happen to know that people in both major parties in Australia are at the moment looking at the possibilities for telethons here. Again, we should be a little wary, I think, judging from the way they've been used in the US. In the Nixon telethons, for example, there was careful vetting of phone calls. It's possible, in other words, to make sure that nasty questions are not put through to the politician on camera. Moreover, it's possible to make sure that the only questions put through to him are those for which he has prepared answers. As a result, he looks good and far more knowledgeable than he really is. In 1960, campaigning in West Virginia, Hubert Humphrey made the mistake of not taking such precautions. The first call he received in a telephone was from a woman who snarled, you get out of West Virginia, Mr. Humphrey." And while Hubert was still reeling, an operator came on the line demanding that he hang up to clear the line for an emergency. The whole thing fell apart after that. There has to be a degree of artificiality, I think, in campaigning, particularly where television is involved, but I think it's also necessary that people realise that and should be informed of it. There are still some campaigning gimmicks which have not yet reached Australia, but they soon will. The use of telephones on a large scale is one example. In the US, telephone campaigning is used extensively. Campaign managers compile lists of telephone subscribers and have a big team of people manning phones. Usually the way it works is that these people dial a voter's number, and when it answers, switch on a recorded message from the candidate. It's possible to have special messages for particular groups from the population, and sometimes people who receive the calls actually believe that they're speaking to the candidate. But even if they realise the voice is recorded, they are presumably flattered by the attention. Another gimmick used in US politics is the personalised letter produced by a computer. Richard Nixon used this in his 1968 campaign. People all over America were invited to ask questions which were recorded on tape at Republican headquarters in each city. These were fed into a computer programmed with Nixon's positions on a variety of issues. The computer would churn out a reply, forge Nixon's signature and mail out a letter which the recipient believed actually came from the candidate. George McGovern used to do the same thing with voters in his home state, possibly still does for all I know. His staff would keep a close watch on local newspapers for items involving voters, deaths in the family and that sort of thing. A computer was programmed to send out form letters to such people, carrying an electronic forgery of McGovern's signature. When a voter received a letter from Senator McGovern offering condolences on the death of his wife, he was no doubt tremendously grateful and impressed that McGovern had remembered him. But there are risks. A couple of years ago I met a McGovern staffer who told me about the computerised letters and how it was done, and he related an anecdote about McGovern campaigning in a small town in his state. A man McGovern did not know from Adam rushed up, shook his hand and said, "Your letter sure was a comfort." McGovern had to think quickly, and he replied that he had been very sorry indeed to hear about the death of the man's wife. Since his wife was very much alive and kicking, the voter was a bit perplexed. The computer had in fact written consoling the gentleman on the loss of some crops in a storm. In 1972, the Labor candidate for Casey in Melbourne, Mr. Race Matthews, he won the seat by the way and is still a member, considered using computerised letters in his campaign. He didn't go ahead with it, I suspect because of the cost, but it's only a matter of time before computers start sending all of us letters before an election signed by our friendly neighbourhood candidates. While we've inherited the Westminster parliamentary system from Britain, or rather the Westminster system as it existed before the British took action to prevent the House of Lords rejecting money bills, our campaigning techniques, like our coca culture, come from the United States, at least for the most part. Perhaps unfortunately we've not adopted the rules which exist in Britain about political advertising on radio and television. The POMs don't allow spot commercials by political parties, 30-second or 60-second ads aimed only at leaving an impression, not conveying information. In Britain, I think, the shortest political message is 5 minutes, and when you have 5 minutes to fill in, you have to say something. Not so here or in the US. We go for short spots where the impression is the message. As a result, Australian political parties are adept at pinching advertising ideas from American agencies involved in campaigning. The technique used in some of the Labor Party's TV commercials in the last election were modelled on commercials Nelson Rockefeller had used in one of his campaigns in New York State. But in case anyone thinks that only the Labor Party people are plagiarists, the slogan used by Mr. Snedden in his mini-campaign in Tasmania at the end of last year was a direct steal from a Rockefeller slogan in the '64 US presidential primary in Oregon. He cared enough to come. While Mr. Snedden was wooing Tasmanian voters, the Labor Party's Federal Secretary and Campaign Director, David Coombe, was in the US looking at the latest crop of American political television commercials, and I would think we'd be seeing some of those ideas on our screens before this year is out. I'd prepared a lot more, but I've run out of time, and I think I'd prefer to answer some questions.
Thanks very much. Somebody like... Somebody like to start with a question? Comment?
I would think 1 week in 3, it's probably worth televising. But I think also it's important to have it every week so that it's more difficult to dodge on that 3rd week. I don't see it on television, but it's certainly valuable for a print journalist to be able to question the Prime Minister. Sometimes it's boring because there are not many issues to ask him about, but when there are issues, he's a captive, and it's important that he should be questioned, I think. I don't know, you'd have to ask Channel 7. I usually see it in person about midday. But I think it's better to show it at that hour of the day, by the way, than not at all. And I think it's important. I think it's important to show it whole rather than edit it too. I think that's very good. After yesterday, I don't think number 96 had a chance. Yes, I think it'd be a good thing, but I think you'd need another channel especially for that. I don't think it would interest the majority of people. And I think it would do a lot of damage to some politicians too, which is also a good thing. Well, I suppose what I meant by that was that Mr. Snedden certainly wants an election. You know, for a number of reasons, partly because he thinks he'd win, partly because he thinks that if he doesn't get an election, he might lose in another area. And I think most Liberals want one. Some of the senators are a bit doubtful, some of them on principle, and some of them because they're quite old and mightn't get another term. But my feeling is that probably they'll do it again.
I meant why it seems to me that the earlier better.
Well, they're their first chances with the 2 supply bills that were introduced earlier this week, but they include things like money to rebuild Darwin, money to rebuild the Tasman Bridge, money for Red Scheme to help unemployed, and special money for the states. And the Liberals wouldn't look too good, I think, if they knocked that back. I think Mr. Whitler would much prefer them to knock those supply bills back than some of the later ones that will come in about May. It depends what happens this year, I think. I think it's important that Mr. Snedden have an election. And if he has an election, he's obviously not under threat. If he wins. If he loses, he's in a bit of trouble.
Yes.
Mr. Oates, is Mr. Gray that assumes leadership of the Liberal Party? If Mr. Gray assumes leadership of the Liberal Party, do you think Mr. Gorton's threat then not to serve will eventuate?
Well, I had dinner with Mr. Gorton the other night, and I mentioned that threat and said I didn't believe it, and he looked up and said, "Don't you now?" So all I can do is report that conversation, and you judge for yourself. Does that work?
Do you wish him to repeat his last comment? Do you mind?
No, I just said that I had dinner with Mr. Gorton last week and mentioned that I didn't believe the threat that he wouldn't serve, and he looked up quietly and said, "Don't you now?" So I think you can judge for yourself.
Right, thank you.
I was wondering if Laurie could tell us something about the way in which the press editors get their journalists' comments and so on to pitch the line they want. So, is the director told them all to do, or sub-editors?
Well, all I can say is what happens with me, and that doesn't happen.
Well, is it sub-editors that will make decisions about what will be addressed in the newspaper?
I decide what will be written. I decide what will be written. That's the editor and the sub-editor, I suppose, who decide what page it appears on, and how much of it appears and what the headline is. But there are never any directions to me.
Yeah, but how does that take the process? You generally, because we talk to them generally after.
Well, every day into a newspaper comes, I suppose, 3 times more news than they can use, because they've only got a certain number of pages, and at the moment there are much fewer pages than normal because there's no advertising and the papers are pretty thin. So that a lot of news just can't get in the paper. On my paper there's a news conference every night at about 5, where the editor and chiefs of staff, night editor and various other executives discuss what they'll use and how prominently and which page it'll be on. That changes as the night goes on and new things happen, but that's the sort of situation in which they make a decision. And I would think it very unlikely that they ever made a decision on political grounds, by the way. Certainly there's never any suggestion to me about the way I should write anything.
Question up here.
You've cited the 1972 and 74 elections as examples where the campaign did make a difference for a year ago. I wonder to what extent marketing firms made this difference, selling political parties, particularly
Advertising agencies. Well, obviously they do make some difference. I think the Singleton agency lost the Liberals quite a few votes last time, campaigning for them. The Labor Party last time made remarkably little use of their advertising agency. They had a bit of a tiff, and David Kerr himself did pretty well all the scripts for television commercials, radio commercials. And he and a man called Kevin Brooks, who also doesn't work for the agency, did all the artwork and layouts. And basically the agency's only job was to book time on radio and television and space in newspapers. The Liberal Party's advertising agency was doing its first election for the Liberals, produced some quite good ads, but the Liberals were a little disappointed. I gather that things are now working out better. The Liberals are sticking with their advertising agency. I'd be very surprised if Labor stays with the one they've used for 20 years. I think the possibility is that the Labor Party will do away with an advertising agency altogether next time. So I would think certainly in the last election the influence of agencies wasn't very major anyway, to answer your question.
Question in the middle here.
Getting away from elections, can you give us some insight on the connection between the press and public service, and perhaps the press and the cabinet ministers, whether it differs between Liberal Party and Liberal Country Party coalition and the Labor Party? Where you have?
Well, the last part's the easiest part. No, it doesn't differ there at all. Except I think that the last Liberal Country Party cabinet was rather easier for journalists than the present Labor cabinet, contrary to all this stuff about Labor leaking like a sieve. I find it fairly hard at the moment to find out what cabinet's done, unfortunately. But as far as public servants go, most journalists, most newspapers in Canberra are fairly understaffed. They're small staff, so there's not much contact with public service departments as such. No newspaper keeps track of what a department is doing. And any contact we have with public servants basically is just with a few select friends who provide information. But there's no proper cover of the public service, except in the Canberra Times, which lives there, where the public service is. Is that what you're
Yes.
saying?
Isn't it an important feature for the press in getting information?
Yeah, it's essential. I would think most leaks.
Mainly in the way of sort of having lunch or down the pub or...
No, it's a bit obvious, mainly just phone calls. But, I would think most big stories would not come from politicians in Canberra. There are public servants of the conscience.
Sorry, did you have questions?
I don't know if they take any notice of what I write, but they do certainly take notice of what they say in an Age leader or a Sydney Morning Herald editorial. I think they take a bit of notice of what I write, but they tend not to tell me about that.
objected on what the state Australian government is equal to mechanism and military manpower. Dominate the way to do in that respect to the power. See a real danger.
I see a real danger in that a lot of people in the Labor Party becoming again disillusioned with the parliamentary system, which I think happened a few years ago. On the other hand, I don't think there'll be any breakdown or anything like that. I think the system's pretty durable. And I would think in what's happened in the last few weeks, both sides are to blame. I must admit that the Lewis thing offended me more than anything else, but other people have different views of that. Certainly both sides have got a fair bit to answer for in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Yesterday I would think that the government came out of it quite badly. Although the incident had its origins in opposition members calling frivolous points of order and interjecting. It's pretty difficult to say one side's to blame at the moment. Well, why do you think it'll be different? I think if they lost another election, they'd be just as determined to get back to power, and that's fairly natural. I think, it's another election loss won't change that, unless they lose the Senate. Mr. Kennedy.
Yes, to what extent do you think political parties deliberately try to condition or educate the public to their own particular political philosophy?
I think I should be asking you that.
You're there.
Well, I would say that the Labor Party hasn't tried very hard. I think that's one of the problems. And I think that's what the Liberals are about to try and do with the mid-term campaign if it happens. But I don't think much of that's been done at all so far in Australian politics. And it's rather interesting that it's going to be tempted.
Over here was one, something.
How close do you think our system is to the situation where campaign funds and elections set directly to money?
Well, in 72, I suppose Labor was outspent very heavily. I think in the last election, the opposition parties would have spent about twice as much as Labor. It didn't seem to make a lot of difference. I suppose it could if ability on both sides in creative advertising was equal and that sort of thing. But I don't think Labor's suffered in the last few years from that.
Mr. Rudd, interesting your comments about Mr. Chipley, because it relates back to an era. Election campaigning seems to be more directed to the public, and people went along to be entertained in a much different fashion to today. Today, the whole thing seems to be engineered to getting people there by bribery. And I wonder if you see a danger that the brouhaha that goes on with political campaigning and electioneering now is really becoming very antiseptic and far less related to the public than it was in the days when mentors used to use it as a magnificent public entertainment. And that there is a real danger that the ad mass type of approach could lead us to a situation where you have the Big Brother type TV interview and nobody gets to see the politicians in the flesh.
Well, actually, that's one of the things I was trying to say, and I think you said it better.
How much you really hear?
But I disagree on one point. I don't think that the gimmicks at the moment are to attract people along to meetings. They're designed to make nice pictures on television and get people involved that way. The people come along to meetings because they're loaded into buses and driven in by the parties, and they're handed signs as they go through the door and told to wave them. And any member of the public who comes in is looked on askance, basically. That's not important.
Alan, and then girl Green.
I thought that was a possibility until Senator Murphy became Mr. Justice Murphy, and now there's no point in that for the Labor Party. That was a possibility while Labor stood to pick up another seat in a half-Senate election, but they've given that one away. So there's no doubt in my mind now that it'll be a double dissolution if there is any election at all this year.
Up the, sorry, there's up the back in the green dress, did you?
Well, the most entertaining is Mungo McCallum. You know, the people I most admire, I suppose, well, certainly a number. Max Walsh, who's now the editor of the Financial Review, still writes politics on occasions, and it's well worth reading. Robert Hawke writes good stuff in the Financial Review. I always read The Age. And Paul Kelly in The Australian, I think, is very good.
Well, did you want to ask questions? Right.
Yes, if I could ask two questions. It seems the increasing cost of collection is crowding out the school parties. It's likely to become a permanent thing. And secondly, there seems to be a lot of disillusionment amongst backbenchers in parliament, that they don't have much control over such things as election campaign. Are we likely to see some decentralisation?
Well, on the first question, I think it's true that the lack of money makes it very hard for small parties because they don't get ABC free time. They miss out on all the free perks, basically. Whatever they get, they've got to pay for. And without Gordon Barton's money or something like it, I think they've got no show. On the second question, it's very true that the backbenchers feel that they don't play a big enough role, and before the last election there was a caucus campaign committee established for that reason, to try and involve backbenchers, get the ministers thinking in terms of looking after backbenchers' interests and involving them in planning, getting the party involving the backbenchers in planning, and that worked to some extent, but the tendency all the time now is towards more centralised campaigns. And the Liberals found last time that you can't do it any other way now that elections are fought on the scale they are now. The Liberals last time called theirs a national campaign committee. But in fact, it wasn't anything of the sort. Queensland stayed right out of it, so did a couple of other states. The ones that were in it still picked and chose the ads they used and when they put them on. This time, the federal director of the Liberal Party will have total control of the campaign, and I don't think backbenchers will get much of a look in at all on either side.
I'm sorry.
One question of a personal nature, perhaps. I was wondering if it's another one. Wondering if you could tell us something of the demands that your job as a political journalist make upon you, so far as hours of work and travelling and what's involved and so on.
Well, apart from going around the world in 38 days every now and again with the Prime Minister, it makes quite a lot of demand. So morning newspaper hours are basically 2 o'clock to 11. So in Canberra we've got to work those hours, but also, the House, for example, most days sits at 10, 10:30. We've got to be there for that. Even when the House isn't sitting, there are things happening in the mornings in Canberra. Most people in Canberra, most journalists in Canberra would basically work, I suppose, 14 hours a day. Except in quiet weeks, and there aren't many of those. And they do have to travel a lot. And there are a lot of divorces. No, I wouldn't agree with it at all. Oh, I'm having talked to Mr. Whitman. I don't think he wants an election. There's no reason why he should. On a thing like that, I do have a personal view, and it influences my writing in a column or a feature, which is signed and it's clearly opinion, and I've expressed a fairly strong view on that. I try not to let my personal views affect the way I treat news. It's pretty difficult, and I don't know if I succeed. I think sometimes I overcompensate. I think that's happened in some of the Sydney afternoon newspapers, and I don't know about the Morassiat here, but on some issues, I would think it happens in some of the Sydney tabloids. Yeah, I don't think it happens in Melbourne newspapers very much. Anyway. I think they've actually been remarkably kind on the Morassiat there. Well, I wrote in the Sun this morning it was because there was a full moon the night before. No, I think they do set a precedent. I don't know about New South Wales. It'll be interesting to see whether that goes the way of Queensland or whether a sophisticated state rejects backwards politics. But in Canberra, I think very much depends on the new speaker and how he handles it. I wouldn't like to be in his position.